Inside a packed federal courtroom, Jasmine Crockett went head-to-head with Judge Barrett over a $50,000 fine, born from nothing but thin air. In just 27 relentless minutes, she shredded 20 years of untouchable power, dragging into the light 3 innocent lives, crushed by gut-feeling verdicts. The air turned electric, the judge's certainty began to fracture. Was this the crack that could bring the whole system crashing down? Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. The morning over Chicago was heavy and dim, a cold wind cutting through the streets as the federal courthouse loomed in silence. On the docket, courtroom 6B showed only one line minor procedural violation. It looked harmless. It wasn't. Jasmine Crockett pushed through the doors, a single folder in hand, her steps steady but sharp. Years in law had taught her that the cases dressed up as small were often the ones built to destroy. At the bench sat Amy Coney Barrett, the judge, whose name alone could freeze a room. Known for her icy tone and her taste for humiliation, she never hid the fact she enjoyed reminding people where they stood in her court. Her gaze locked on Jasmine the moment she entered, cold and unblinking like a sniper waiting for the target to move. The air felt wired, tense, every breath loud in the stillness. It was more than formality. It was the kind of atmosphere that said the ending had already been written. And Barrett's eyes made it clear she planned to be the one holding the pen. The tension from the previous moment didn't just linger, it thickened, curling through the air, like smoke that refused to clear. The clerk's voice barely finished calling the case when Amy Coney Barrett lowered herself into the high-back chair. Her movements measured, deliberate, the kind of control that told everyone in the room she was in no rush to prove her authority because she already believed she owned it. Without even glancing toward Jasmine, her voice rang out crisp and unyielding, $50,000. Fine imposed. No explanation, no pause, no chance to speak. It was a verdict fired like a bullet before the trial had even begun. Only then did Barrett's gaze find Jasmine, eyes sharp as glass. Ms. Crockett, this is not a political science seminar. This is a real court, and here, I am the only one who decides. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word was a blade polished and precise, meant to cut without spilling a drop. She lifted Jasmine's submission between two fingers, turning the pages as though each sheet was contaminated. I read what you submitted. Honestly, it reads more like a bad freshman essay than any legal document. The insult wasn't shouted, it was delivered with surgical calm, the kind that stripped away dignity, one syllable at a time. Barrett's hand dropped the papers back onto the bench with a faint slap. I will not waste this court's time on your overconfident theories. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her hands remained flat on the table, her posture unbroken, but there was a steadiness in her eyes that didn't match the role Barrett was trying to force on her. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the sharpness of defense, only the steel of certainty. I request the right to present my defense under the Constitution, a right this court cannot take away. The room seemed to contract, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above, as if even the building itself was holding its breath. Barrett gave no sign she had heard, no flicker of acknowledgement. Instead, she sat with the stillness of someone convinced the decision had already been carved into the granite of the courthouse steps. And in that moment, Jasmine knew beyond doubt this fine wasn't a punishment for a violation. It was a public attempt to crush her, a deliberate display of power aimed at breaking her before she could even stand. The air in the courtroom was still heavy with the sting of Barrett's earlier words, but Jasmine's expression had not cracked. She sat unmoving for a long second, letting the silence work for her. The fine had been slammed down like a hammer, the insults delivered like a slow dissection. But she knew the one thing Barrett hadn't counted on, that she was ready for this. Her hand moved to the leather folder before her fingers brushing the worn edge. The sound of the clasp releasing was small, almost soft, but in the tight air of the room it felt like a gun being cocked. She didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, the careful pace of someone who wanted the judge to feel each second stretching, to know she wasn't rattled. From inside the folder, she drew out the first document, sliding it onto the table, where the light caught its heading. Sullivan versus Illinois. She began, her tone low but edged with steel. She didn't just name the case, she painted its relevance in clean, direct strokes. In this matter, the court held that no financial penalty can be sustained without tangible evidence, because due process is not a suggestion. It's an obligation. She let that hang for a beat, her eyes locked on Barrett's as if daring her to challenge the principal. Then she moved to the next her fingers, finding the second tab with practiced ease. The paper made a sharp, clean snap as she turned it. Henderson versus St. Petersburg, she continued, where the court made clear that assumption is not proof and guesswork has no place in a legal ruling. She leaned forward slightly, her voice growing firmer. Both precedents reject the idea that authority alone can justify punishment. They require the state to prove, not presume. She tapped a single finger on the empty evidence record before them. And here there is nothing to prove. No photographs, no sworn affidavits, no physical record. Just the word of one man who says, "I know what I saw," as if that alone could rise to the standard of law. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The precision of her words was sharper than any shout, and the stillness in the courtroom made each syllable land heavier. Jasmine let the quiet linger for a moment, then delivered the line that cut through the air like shattering glass. A judgment without evidence is not law. It's arbitrariness dressed in legal robes. She didn't blink as she said, it didn't soften it to spare feelings. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but every word carried the weight of an accusation that could not be ignored. The phrase hung in the space between them, challenging anyone present to disagree without revealing their own bias. She straightened, her voice steady but more pointed now, threading each sentence with the urgency of a warning. If this stands, she said, then every citizen becomes prey to the whims of power without any proof. Her gaze swept the room, moving beyond the bench to the faces in the gallery. It means a neighbor's grudge could cost you your home. A rival's lie could strip you of your work. A stranger's opinion could empty your bank account, all without a shred of evidence to defend yourself. She paused on the last words, letting the horror of that possibility settle in. The air in the courtroom shifted. Even those who had been leaning back in their seats were now sitting straighter, their eyes locked on her. Jasmine's voice had not broken pace or volume, but it carried the charge of someone speaking not just to win a case, but to expose a threat. She knew exactly what she was doing, forcing everyone in the room to imagine themselves in the same position, to see that this was not just her fight. Her hand moved to the evidence file once more, lifting it slightly before setting it down again with a quiet, deliberate thud. This is not about one fine, she continued, her words still measured. This is about whether we allow the courtroom to become a place where personal opinion is enough to destroy someone's life. Whether we accept that a position of power can replace the burden of proof. Her gaze returned to Barrett, steady and unwavering. That is not the law our Constitution was built on. That is not justice. For a brief moment, Barrett said nothing. She didn't reach for her pen, didn't glance at the file, didn't even shift in her chair. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the far wall each second, marking the distance between Jasmine's challenge and Barrett's response. The judge's eyes remained fixed, unreadable, but the silence spoke volumes. It was the pause of someone calculating, not conceding. Jasmine held her ground, meeting that silence with her own. She knew the judge's next move would not be to admit defeat, not here, not in front of this audience. But she also knew she had forced a crack in the wall. The facts were now in the open, the legal precedent laid bare, and any ruling that ignored them would be a ruling that announced itself as corrupt. In the tension of that standoff, the air seemed almost to vibrate. Finally, Barrett leaned forward, the gavel in her hand, shifting just enough to tap against the bench. Her voice came sharp and clipped, as if breaking the moment before it grew too dangerous. 15-minute recess to review. The words carried the mask of procedure, but the undercurrent was obvious. This was not a break to reflect. It was a pause to regroup, to find a way to push back against a challenge she had not expected to meet with such precision. Jasmine sat back, the folder still open before her, the names of Sullivan and Henderson in plain sight. She didn't smile, didn't show triumph. This was not the moment for celebration. It was the moment to let the truth she had planted settle deep where it could not be easily uprooted. And as Barrett rose from the bench, Jasmine kept her eyes on her, unblinking, letting the judge know without a single word that she saw the move for what it was: not a retreat, but a reload. The 15 minutes of recess felt like they were stretched on a rack, each second pulled longer than the last. People shifted in their seats, whispering in low voices that died quickly under the weight of the tension. When the side door finally opened, the sound of it cutting through the silence was sharp enough to turn every head. Barrett re-entered, first her expression still carved from stone, but this time she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was Judge Thomas Whitaker, a figure who carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his stride unhurried, yet deliberate, the robe draping around him like the dark outline of a verdict not yet spoken. His silvered hair and deep-set eyes gave him the look of someone who had seen every trick, every gamble, and every downfall that had ever played out inside a courtroom. The air shifted instantly. The quiet before had been tense, but this was different, heavier, more dangerous. It was as if the oxygen had thinned, as though the presence of this second judge had turned the room from a place of procedure into a live arena. Barrett took her seat again, without so much as a glance toward Jasmine, but her posture told its own story. This was no longer a one-on-one. She had brought in backup, and not just any backup, but a man whose name carried weight in every legal circle worth mentioning. Whitaker didn't sit immediately. He stood beside the bench for a moment, scanning the gallery, then letting his eyes settle on Jasmine. The look wasn't hostile, but it wasn't casual either. It was the deliberate measuring gaze of a man who was already running her arguments through the machinery of his mind, testing for cracks before she'd even spoken. Whitaker's expression remained neutral, but there was calculation behind it, the kind that didn't miss a flicker of doubt or the smallest slip in composure. He was the kind of judge who could nod politely while dismantling you piece by piece, and Jasmine knew it. The message was clear. Without a single word being spoken, this was no longer a minor matter. This was a legal battle with stakes far higher than the docket had suggested, and the second player had just stepped onto the field, ready to see if her case could survive the weight of two benches instead of one. The tension from Whitaker's entrance still clung to the walls when the bailiff's voice cut through the air, calling the next witness. All eyes turned toward the side door as Nathan Ellis stepped into the room. He wasn't dressed in the standard courthouse blandness. His suit was crisp, his tie knotted with precision shoes polished to a dull shine. There was a quiet confidence in his stride, the kind that comes from years of walking into courtrooms convinced your word carries more weight than paper. His face was set in stone, no trace of a smile, and his eyes scanned the room only briefly before locking forward. He moved like a man who'd already decided the outcome and was just there to make it official. He stepped forward without hesitation, raised his right hand, and said clearly, "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." His voice was steady, carrying easily in the hushed room. Then he lowered his arm, sat in the witness chair, with his back straight and shoulders squared. One leg crossed over the other, his hands folded neatly in his lap, the posture of a man in control. But to Jasmine, it was also the posture of a man too comfortable, too certain the system would shield him from scrutiny. She rose from her chair, picking up a slim folder, and approached the podium with a pace that was neither rushed nor hesitant, the kind of walk that says every step is planned. Her eyes locked on his, and the first question landed clean. "Do you have a photo of the violation?" The words were sharp, trimmed of any excess, delivered in a tone that left no soft edges to hide behind. Ellis didn't flinch, but he didn't answer right away either, as if weighing how little he could say without sounding evasive. Before he could speak, Jasmine closed the gap with a second strike. "Do you have a written report or a second witness?" The questions came like twin rounds fired in quick succession, not shouted, not theatrical, but tight and precise, the kind meant to pin a man in place. Ellis leaned back slightly in the chair, a small movement that might have looked casual to anyone else, but to Jasmine it was the tell of someone bracing for the hit. His answer came flat and confident. "No need, I have 20 years of experience. I know a violation when I see it." His voice carried a practiced authority, the kind of tone meant to suggest that his words should end the discussion. In the gallery, a murmur rippled through the rows, not loud enough to disrupt the court, but enough to register that the room had caught the arrogance in his statement. From the bench, Barrett's eyes sharpened, her lips tightening as if in approval, while Whitaker's gaze shifted slightly, studying Ellis the way a craftsman inspects a tool, deciding if it's reliable or about to break under pressure. Jasmine stood still for a moment, letting the silence after his answer expand just enough to make him feel its weight. Then slowly she let a cold, almost imperceptible smile form at the corner of her mouth. She took one step forward, the click of her heel echoing in the hushed space, and her voice cut through with surgical precision. "Mr. Ellis," she began, her tone even, but with an undercurrent of steel and law. 20 years of experience cannot substitute for admissible evidence. She didn't raise her voice, but the clarity of her words seemed to slice through the air. Her gaze stayed locked on him, not moving for even a heartbeat. "What you call a violation is nothing more than personal perception." The last two words hung in the air, deliberate, almost heavy. The courtroom stilled. Even those who weren't versed in legal standards understood the impact. She had just reduced 2 decades of his self-assured authority to nothing more than a subjective opinion. Ellis shifted in his seat just slightly, but it was enough. Jasmine didn't press further. She didn't need to. The damage was done. Every jurist, every observer in that room now had a seed planted, the awareness that without hard evidence, his statement wasn't a fact. It was a feeling, and feelings don't win in a court of law. The sting of Ellis's answer was still vibrating through the air when Jasmine turned her back on the witness stand. Her movement was deliberate, not rushed, the kind of turn that told everyone in the room she had one more strike ready, and it wouldn't be aimed at Ellis or even the bench. Her eyes swept over the gallery, locking on faces one by one, as if she were picking them out from a lineup. The murmur in the room died instantly. When she spoke, her voice was steady low, but with a weight that made every syllable land hard. "If this ruling stands," she said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle, "then any one of you could lose $50,000 because someone feels you did something wrong." The silence was thick, but the shift in the gallery was unmistakable. A man in the back crossed his arms tighter. A woman in the second row leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You could feel the slow ripple of unease, the understanding that she wasn't talking in hypotheticals. Jasmine took a step toward the rail, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each sound like a drum beat pulling the room closer. "This isn't theory," she continued, her tone sharpening. "This has happened. Sergeant Michael Harris, a veteran who wore the uniform for this country, lost his license because of a clerical error in a date field. A single line on a form typed wrong, and 20 years of service meant nothing." Her gaze moved to a man in the front row, holding it for a second before she shifted her focus again. She didn't stop. "Daniel Ruiz, a master electrician," she went on, "was banned from working because of a violation code no one could explain. Not the inspector, not the clerk, not even the department that issued it. He was told it was the rule, so it was enforced. And that was it." The air seemed to tighten with each example. People shifted in their seats, not out of boredom, but because the scenarios she was painting were too easy to imagine themselves in. Jasmine didn't let up. And Samuel Brooks, a retired rancher in Texas, she said, her voice dropping just slightly, was fined for building a fence after someone misread a property line. He lost months fighting it, and in the end, he paid for a mistake that wasn't his. Every story hit like a hammer, each one stripping away the illusion that justice was guaranteed just because you were innocent. Jasmine let the silence stretch after the last example, her eyes scanning the room again, searching for the flickers of recognition, the uncomfortable truth settling in. Then she delivered the line that made the room feel colder, the words coming slow but hard, like the final warning before a storm. "Uncontrolled power will swallow justice whole, and when that happens, no one is safe." The words didn't just echo. They seemed to hang in the stillness, suspended between the high walls and the polished floor. No one spoke, no one moved. Even Barrett's expression was unreadable, her pen frozen above her notepad. Whitaker's eyes narrowed just slightly, as if weighing not just the statement, but the conviction behind it. Jasmine didn't blink. She stood in that moment like someone who had just placed an unshakable truth in the center of the room, daring anyone, judge, witness, or bystander, to step forward and try to break it. The air in the courtroom was still electric from Jasmine's last warning, the words "no one is safe" clinging to the walls like the echo of a gunshot. For a long moment, neither bench nor witness moved. Then Barrett leaned forward, her robe shifting slightly as she rested both hands on the edge of the bench. Her chin lifted, and when she spoke, her voice was sharp, deliberate, the tone of someone reclaiming the floor by force. "The court has the right to self-determination," she said. Each syllable landed like a gavel strike, meant to signal that her authority was not up for debate. The words weren't just procedural. They were a declaration, a warning that she still saw herself as the final arbiter of what would stand in this room. Jasmine didn't sit back. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, the soles of her shoes clicking once on the polished floor before her voice cut in, clean and unyielding. Self-determination does not mean standing above the law, she said, and the words came not as an opinion, but as a sentence carved into stone. She let the first phrase breathe for half a beat before she drove the rest in. This law was not written to protect power. It was written to protect the people from power. Her tone was not loud, but it was razor sharp, the kind of delivery that turned the phrase into a weapon. The shift in the room was instant. In the gallery, heads turned toward the bench, waiting for a response. Even Ellis, still seated in the witness box, straightened in his chair. The air between Barrett and Jasmine felt taut, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. Barrett's jaw tightened, her eyes locking on Jasmine's, as though she could break the force of the words by sheer will. But the stillness at the other end of the bench broke first. Whitaker leaned forward, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that filled the room. "I agree with Ms. Crockett," he said. There was no hesitation, no conditional language. The agreement fell like a stone in water, sending ripples through the courtroom. It was a rare moment, one judge openly aligning with the challenger in front of another judge. Barrett's pen, which had been resting against her notepad, tapped once against the paper, the sound sharp in the silence. She looked down, not to read, but to buy herself seconds, her fingers tightening on the edge of the bench. This was the pause of someone calculating, running through possible exits, and finding each one blocked. The evidence was absent. The precedent was clear, and now her own colleague had spoken against her position. The hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder in the stillness. Finally, Barrett's gaze lifted, her expression a mask of judicial neutrality, but the set of her shoulders betrayed the inevitability of what was coming. Her voice, when it returned, was stripped of ornament, as if she wanted the ruling to pass without giving it more oxygen than necessary. "The court finds there is insufficient evidence to uphold the fine." She said each word deliberate, her cadence slower than before. A pause, then the final line. "The penalty is vacated." The words settled into the air like the last chord of a long, tense symphony, not triumphant, but undeniable. There was no applause, no outburst from the gallery, just a palpable shift, the release of a breath the entire room had been holding. Barrett didn't meet Jasmine's eyes as she set down her pen, but she didn't need to. The ruling spoke for itself. Jasmine remained standing, her face steady, but the undercurrent of victory was there, not loud, not boastful, but solid and immovable, like a verdict carved into the foundation of the court itself. The ruling still hung in the air, like the final note of a symphony no one wanted to end. The soundless weight of it pressed down on the gallery, on the attorneys, even on the clerks who sat frozen in place. For a moment, the only movement came from Barrett herself, her hand resting on the bench fingers, still from the gavel she no longer needed to lift. She didn't look at her papers. She didn't look at Whitaker. She looked at Jasmine. Really looked at her for the first time since the hearing began. There was no fire in her eyes now, no icy dismissal, no calculated distance. What replaced it was something far rarer in a room built on hierarchy: recognition. A subtle shift in the set of her mouth, a faint narrowing of her eyes, as if she were recalibrating every assumption she had made. When she spoke, her voice was softer than anyone in that room had heard it all day, but the low register only made the words carry further. "I underestimated you. A great deal." It wasn't an admission meant for the record. It wasn't meant for Whitaker or the gallery or the reporters scribbling in the back. It was for Jasmine alone, a concession delivered without ceremony, but with the weight of truth. You could almost hear the collective inhale from the gallery, a ripple of disbelief that Judge Amy Coney Barrett, who prided herself on never showing deference, had just offered something close to respect. Jasmine didn't rush her reply. She held Barrett's gaze steady and unflinching, letting the moment stand on its own. Then the corners of her mouth curved into a controlled, knowing smile, not the smile of someone savoring a victory, but the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had heard this before. "Not the first," she said evenly, and certainly not the last. Her tone was calm, even warm, but there was a steel undercurrent in it, the reminder that she'd been here before and would be here again. The words weren't defiance, they were fact. Barrett's chin dipped just slightly, the smallest of nods, as though to seal the unspoken truce between them. The gesture was subtle enough that anyone blinking might have missed it, but Jasmine didn't. She closed the leather folder in front of her, with deliberate care, the soft thud of its cover sounding louder than it should in the hushed chamber. Her pen, the same one she'd used to underline case law and jot quick counters, slid neatly into the spine before she set the folder under her arm. She didn't turn toward the door immediately. For a beat, she stood there facing the bench, her stance straight, her breathing steady. It wasn't the posture of a victor basking in triumph, but of a professional who had delivered her case to the fullest and left nothing unspoken. Then she pivoted her heels, striking the marble floor with a crisp, echoing rhythm that cut cleanly through the silence. The aisle cleared instinctively, people leaning back in their seats as she passed, some watching with open admiration, others with the guarded calculation of those trying to place her in a different category now. The double doors loomed ahead, their brass handles catching the cold light from above. As she reached them, the hinges groaned faintly, the sound breaking the oppressive stillness for the first time. She stepped through without looking back, but the absence she left behind was immediate and heavy. In her wake, the room didn't rush to refill the space with chatter or movement. Barrett remained still. Whitaker sat with hands folded, and the gallery stayed locked in their seats as if unwilling to disturb the moment. It was not the silence of confusion or defeat. It was the kind of silence that comes after something unshakable has been spoken and cannot be taken back, a silence that acknowledged the shift that had just occurred. For all the tension, all the clashes, and all the force that had been wielded in that room, the final exchange between Barrett and Jasmine had left the strongest impression. It was more than a reversal of a penalty. It was the restoration of something fundamental, something the room had felt, even if no one had put it into words. The law had been heard, and in that space, as the last trace of her footsteps faded beyond the doors, it was clear to everyone present that it had been heard through her. The weight of that courtroom moment didn't fade as Jasmine stepped beyond the heavy wooden doors it detonated. The ruling, the exchange, the undeniable precedent she had forced into the record, all of it began to travel like an electrical current through the legal system. It started quietly at first in the echo chambers of legal circles and late-night emails between city attorneys. Then it hit the desks of council members, mayors, and state oversight boards with the force of a siren blaring at 3 a.m. By sunrise the next day, municipal councils in cities across the country were scrambling. Chicago was the first to move, the same city where Barrett had tried to shut Jasmine down. The mayor's office issued an internal memo marked urgent immediate review, calling every department head into an unscheduled morning meeting. Their single agenda item was blunt: identify every fine issued without admissible evidence in the last 10 years. The message was clear: this was no longer business as usual. Dallas followed within hours, its city hall lit up late into the night as lawyers pored over files stacked chest high on oak conference tables. Phoenix, Miami, Denver, and Philadelphia soon joined in, each launching their own version of what officials quietly began calling the Crockett sweep. Entire departments were reassigned to comb through case histories. File rooms that hadn't been opened in years were unlocked, their stale air mixing with the tension in the halls. Clerks and assistants wore the look of people who knew they were uncovering landmines buried in paperwork. The first numbers back were worse than anyone wanted to believe. Hundreds of cases in each city, some going back decades, had one thing in common: fines and penalties handed down with no photographic evidence, no signed affidavits, no secondary witnesses, nothing. Just the unverified word of an enforcement officer or an inspector who knew it when they saw it. The scale was jaw-dropping. We're looking at systemic malpractice, one city attorney in Cleveland admitted during a hastily called press conference, his voice tight, his eyes fixed on the cluster of microphones in front of him. This isn't a clerical error problem. This is a structural failure. That soundbite went national in minutes. Cable news hosts tore into the numbers during prime time, their voices rising with outrage as they read examples on air. In one case, a single mother in St. Louis had been fined $7,500 for improper waste disposal when her garbage cans were left at the curb while she was in the hospital giving birth. In another, a retired teacher in Seattle had been charged nearly $20,000 for illegal exterior modifications after repainting his front door without a permit, despite the city having no photographic proof the change violated any ordinance. Each example poured gasoline on a growing fire. Inside city halls, the pressure was immediate and personal. Mayors were calling emergency sessions of their councils, hammering the same question into every legal director and enforcement chief. How many of these are ours? Some answers came back in single digits. Others came back in triple figures. And every number, no matter how small, carried the same implication: they had been taking money from citizens without the basic standard of proof the law required. The audits weren't just happening in big cities. Small towns in Ohio, rural counties in Georgia, and coastal districts in California began digging into their own records after residents showed up at council meetings waving copies of Jasmine Crockett's case transcript. The spark had jumped jurisdictions. It was no longer a matter of isolated incidents. This was beginning to look like a nationwide pattern. The media moved in like sharks to blood. National outlets shifted their weekend lineups to accommodate the wave of interest. Headlines screamed in 72-point font, "No proof." Big fines and justice sold short. Reporters who had been covering politics and crime were suddenly showing up in code enforcement offices and municipal records departments, cameras rolling as they demanded answers. News vans lined the curbs outside courthouses, their antennas stabbing the sky. By the time Sunday rolled around, 60 Minutes had claimed the centerpiece of the story. Their producers had moved with surgical speed, lining up interviews with whistleblowers, former city employees, and victims of evidence-free fines. In one teaser clip, a whistleblower from New Orleans Department of Inspections looked directly into the camera and said, "We were told to trust our gut." That's what they called it: trust your gut and write the ticket. In another, a former defendant held up her case file showing a blank evidence section. "This is all they had on me," she said. "Nothing." And they took $12,000. The show's investigative team began weaving Jasmine's case into a larger narrative, a profile of a broken system propped up by unchecked authority. They replayed her exact words from the hearing: "Self-determination does not mean standing above the law. This law was not written to protect power. It was written to protect the people from power." The line had already gone viral on social media, clipped and subtitled by activists, but hearing it in the deep, measured narration of 60 Minutes gave it a different weight. It sounded less like a soundbite and more like a standard the country had forgotten it was supposed to live by. In living rooms, diners, and airport lounges, people were watching this unfold in real time. Legal aid hotlines reported record spikes in calls, many of them from citizens asking if they could challenge old fines. Nonprofits that specialized in wrongful convictions were pivoting resources toward municipal penalties, suddenly recognizing the scale of the issue. Even private law firms were advertising free case reviews with a focus on evidence-based challenges to city-imposed fines. It was the kind of moment that didn't just dominate the news cycle, it began to change the culture of conversation. At dinner tables, people were asking each other if they'd ever been fined for something they couldn't remember anyone proving. In office break rooms, workers swapped stories about tickets and penalties that had always felt unfair but never seemed worth fighting until now. The pressure on municipal governments was relentless. The audits continued to expand. Some cities announced restitution plans, promising to reimburse citizens for unjust fines. Others tried to bury their findings, only to have leaks force them into the open. The scrutiny wasn't stopping, and the precedent set in that Chicago courtroom was now a living, breathing force, reshaping the balance between the governed and the governing. What had begun as one case, one fine, one hearing, one confrontation, had grown into something no one could have predicted. It wasn't just Jasmine Crockett's name on the transcripts anymore. It was her words, her arguments, her refusal to bend that had lit a fuse running straight into the heart of the system. And with every new audit, every new headline, and every 60-minute segment, that fuse burned hotter. The reckoning was no longer looming. It was here. The storm of investigations and headlines was still raging when the true weight of what had happened began to settle into the bones of the legal system. What Jasmine Crockett had achieved wasn't just the reversal of an unjust fine, and it wasn't just a high-profile courtroom win that would fade after a few news cycles. It was something far more permanent, a recalibration of the rules themselves. Across courtrooms, city halls, and legal forums, the conversation had shifted. People weren't talking about that Chicago case anymore. They were talking about the Crockett Standard. 3 words, no evidence, no penalty were moving through the country's legal arteries like a new pulse, steady and undeniable. It started behind closed doors. In conference rooms lined with case files and coffee-stained agendas, city attorneys were pulling out old policies and rewriting them in real time. No one wanted to be the next municipality humiliated on the evening news for levying a fine without admissible proof. In some offices, it was a matter of survival, mayors demanding immediate overhauls, legal directors issuing memos that left no room for interpretation. If you can't prove it, you can't enforce it. One directive read the language stripped of legalese, so even the greenest rookie could understand. The old practice of trusting an inspector's word as gospel was over. In courtrooms, the shift was just as visible. Judges who had once waved cases forward without a second thought now began their hearings with a single question: where is the proof? No photos, no signed statements, no corroborating witness. The case didn't just lose momentum, it died where it stood. Some prosecutors tried to push through on sheer confidence, but the bench wasn't having it. The burden had shifted back where it belonged, and once that balance had been restored, it was impossible to unsee the difference. Out in the field, the change was even more dramatic. Code enforcement officers, health inspectors, and police officers were suddenly operating under a new level of scrutiny. Departments were issuing new training manuals overnight. Every inspection now came with a checklist, photographic evidence, time-stamped and clear, written reports signed and dated, at least one independent verification. Without those, there would be no citation, no ticket, no penalty. For veterans who had built their reputations on knowing it when they saw it, this was a hard adjustment. Some bristled, muttering about red tape and overcorrection, but others recognized the truth. If the law's authority didn't rest on proof, it rested on nothing. The academic world took notice too. In law schools from New York to Los Angeles, professors began using Jasmine's cross-examination of Nathan Ellis as a case study. They replayed her words, "In law, 20 years of experience cannot substitute for admissible evidence," and broke down the strategic precision behind them. It wasn't just about dismantling a witness. It was about redefining the standard in a way that anyone, lawyer or not, could understand. Students scribbled notes knowing they were watching a line that would live in legal briefs for years to come. Public defenders were perhaps the fastest to weaponize it. For them, the Crockett Standard wasn't just a principle, it was a lifeline for clients who'd been steamrolled by flimsy accusations. They began quoting Jasmine's exact language in hearings. Self-determination does not mean standing above the law. This law was not written to protect power, it was written to protect the people from power. The impact was immediate. Cases that would have quietly ended in plea deals or settlements were suddenly being thrown out for lack of evidence. The playing field wasn't level yet, but for the first time in a long time, it felt closer. Ordinary people began to take notice too. They showed up to hearings armed with a new simple question: where is the proof? It was a phrase that needed no legal training to deploy, but it carried the full weight of the precedent Jasmine had set. When an official tried to dance around the answer, citizens knew to press harder. They understood that the absence of proof wasn't a detail, it was the entire case collapsing under its own weight. The transformation was subtle, but powerful people walked into hearings, no longer assuming they were already halfway defeated. The ripple effect spread in every direction. Power for once was feeling the pressure. Agencies that had operated with a CT first justify, later mentality found themselves on the defensive. The old shield of procedure no longer worked if the core requirement proof was missing. The momentum that had long favored authority had reversed, flowing back toward the citizens it was supposed to protect. It wasn't just about preventing bad rulings in the future. It was about correcting the structure that allowed them in the first place. The system was being forced to remember its original order: prove first, punish second. And proof didn't mean a hunch or a memory or a confident declaration. It meant something that could stand in daylight, withstand scrutiny, and be tested without crumbling. That's why this wasn't just a win for Jasmine. It was a reset button for the principles the justice system was meant to run on. In a country where too many people had been left fighting shadows, she had dragged the burden of proof back into the light. The Crockett Standard wasn't a law written in a statute book, but it might as well have been. It was already shaping behavior, rewriting procedures, and changing outcomes. And like any true foundation stone, it wasn't flashy. It didn't come with speeches or ceremonies. It sat solid and immovable beneath the noise, supporting the weight of every case that would now have to meet it. Years from now, when the headlines were long gone and the news vans had moved on, that stone would still be there. Courtrooms would still open with the same first question. Citizens would still know the power of asking for proof. And in the quiet, unglamorous language of real change, that would be the mark she left, a single brick set straight with her name etched into the mortar, Jasmine Crockett. The noise of audits and headlines began to dim, and in that quieter space, a deeper truth stepped forward like a figure emerging from smoke. The human lesson did not arrive with a gavel strike or a breaking ticker. It arrived in the stillness after the storm. It said that rules mean nothing unless they protect a living person standing alone beneath them. It said that authority without proof is only force dressed up as form. It said that a courtroom is not a theater for power, but a shelter for the vulnerable. It said that confidence is not evidence, and rank is not truth. It said that a system earns respect only when it respects the smallest voice in the room. It said that fairness cannot be borrowed from tomorrow. It must be paid out today, case by case. It said most of all that the distance between law and justice is closed by courage, listening, and proof. The first layer of the lesson was about power, and it was blunt. Power must carry receipts before it carries penalties. A badge, a title, or a robe can organize a room, but they cannot replace the facts that make a judgment lawful. No evidence, no penalty was not a slogan. It was a return to the basic agreement citizens make with their government. That agreement trades obedience for fairness, taxes for services, and trust for honest process. When proof leads and punishment follows, that agreement holds. When punishment arrives first, the agreement breaks. The story exposed how easily habit can drift into hubris and how hubris shrinks when asked to bring its files. The human lesson says, let power serve by proving, not by presuming. Let the strongest arm be the one turning pages, not pushing people. The second layer was about courage, and it was quiet rather than loud. Courage did not look like shouting. It looked like steady questions asked in a measured voice. It looked like opening a folder at the exact second the room tried to shut down the argument. It looked like holding eye contact when a bench attempted to bury a point under procedure. It looked like standing still long enough for the silence to become a verdict in itself. Courage in this story carried a scalpel, not a hammer. It cut, separated, and exposed. That kind of courage is learnable, and therefore repeatable, which is the most hopeful part of all. The lesson says ordinary people can train their fear to arrive a minute late. The lesson says composure is a form of evidence too, because it keeps the facts in focus when pressure tries to blur them. The third layer was about listening, and it demanded humility from every seat in the room. Listening is not waiting to speak. It is letting another person's facts reshape the map inside the mind. A judge who says, I underestimated you. A great deal performs a rare civic service, the service of public recalibration. That admission teaches that status can bend without breaking, and that truth can change direction without shame. Listening is also what tied the courtroom to the street, bringing the veteran, the electrician, and the Texas rancher into view. Their stories were not props. They were the reasons the rules exist. The law cannot protect a theory. It protects a person, a paycheck, a home. The human lesson insists that justice begins where an individual life begins to strain under weight it did not earn. The fourth layer was about language, because words either open doors or lock them. The case taught how plain language can bring a system back to ground. Phrases like, a judgment without evidence is not law, and this law was written to protect the people from power, functioned as keys, not ornaments. They brought complicated doctrine into the reach of a crowded gallery, a late-night city council, a kitchen table. Strong language did not inflate. It clarified. It did not perform. It cut through. The lesson says that clarity is a civic resource and that every clear sentence is a small public good. When rules are explained in words that everyone understands, accountability stops being a mystery and starts being a habit. The fifth layer was about solidarity, the way one voice can light up a hallway of doors that others then walk through. A single hearing traveled into 1,000 rooms because the principle inside it was portable. People in distant cities repeated the same question and found that the ground shifted beneath identical mistakes. Solidarity in this story did not require slogans or marches. It required repetition of a simple demand, show the proof. Each citizen who learned that line gained a small shield, and many small shields began to look like armor. The lesson says community does not always arrive as a crowd. Sometimes it arrives as a chorus of the same sentence spoken calmly in many places. When public expectation hardens around fairness, institutions adapt faster than any decree can force them. The sixth layer was about time in the work it asked for. A single case can feel like a flare, bright and brief, but a standard settles in like masonry. Bricks do not boast, they hold weight. The brick this story set in place was the order of operations: verify before you punish, prove before you take. Over time, checklists change because bricks do not move. Over time, fear changes sides because bricks will not be argued into silence. The lesson says real victories are not loud. They are load-bearing. They do not finish the conversation. They make the next honest conversation possible. The seventh layer was about dignity, the quiet currency at the center of every lawful system. Dignity means a person is not treated as a suspect by default. Dignity means a worker does not lose a license to a typo or a hunch. Dignity means a homeowner is not billed for a mistake he did not make just because an office needs to balance totals. Dignity in a courtroom is the chair pulled out for the person with the fewest resources and the least practice speaking. The lesson says institutions do not become dignified by demanding respect. They become dignified by defending it. Every time a rule bends toward a person rather than around them, the system earns a little more of the faith it asks to be given. The eighth layer was about restraint, which is a strange hero in action stories, but a real hero in civic life. Restraint kept the questions short and the record clean. Restraint refused to trade insult for insult, even when insult was offered. Restraint honored the difference between anger and precision, and because of that difference, precision prevailed. The bench ultimately chose restraint as well, stepping back from a bad path and acknowledging the better one standing in front of it. That choice mattered not because it made anyone look generous, but because it made the ruling look lawful. The lesson says the strongest move is often the smallest, the refusal to press advantage when the law itself is already enough. The ninth layer was about hope, not as a feeling, but as a schedule. Hope turned into policy when departments rewrote their training. Hope turned into practice when clerks refused to file incomplete citations. Hope turned into protection when judges made, "Where is the proof?" their first line instead of their last. Hope in this account became a habit. The habit did not erase every error, but it reduced the surface area where error could grow. The lesson says hope is not a mood, it is maintenance. It checks the locks at night and oils the hinges in the morning. All those layers continue to point toward one core. Justice is a craft, not a spectacle. Craft requires discipline, feedback, and correction. Craft accepts that even experts misjudge, and that course correction is a mark of health, not weakness. Craft cares about tools, and the best tools in a courtroom are facts that can be examined by anyone who steps close. Craft is slow until it is suddenly swift like a door that resists and then opens cleanly when the right key turns. The human lesson says that a system built on craft will survive storms that a system built on personality never could. The craft on display in this story was the craft of asking, proving, and deciding in that order. The story also teaches something intimate about character. Character is not the absence of mistakes. It is the speed and honesty with which mistakes are confronted. A judge who refuses to budge becomes an obstacle. A judge who reconsiders becomes a guardian again. A lawyer who insists on proof does not merely protect a client. She protects the ground everyone will walk on later. A witness who learns the difference between experience and evidence receives the same protection he once believed only power could give. Character spreads when one person shows how it works under pressure and others recognize the design as useful. The lesson says character, like law, is most visible when it chooses the harder right over the easier wrong. Another part of the lesson is about scale and how small things grow. A sentence spoken in a courtroom passed into city memos, training slides, and dinner table conversations. A handful of overturned fines became a blueprint for preventing hundreds more. A local story produced a national habit of asking for receipts. None of this felt cinematic while it was happening. It felt like work. But the camera, if it were rolling, would have captured something worth watching: seriousness replacing swagger, humility replacing heat verification, replacing velocity. The lesson says the most thrilling thing a public can witness is a system remembering what it is for. Finally, the lesson is about inheritance. Every generation receives a justice system in a certain condition and decides whether to pass it on better or worse. This story adds one brick that future hands will not need to argue about. They will simply build on top of it. The brick says that proof is the price of punishment in a free society. The brick says that people come first, process comes second, and power comes last. The brick says that fairness must be obvious before it becomes enforceable. That brick will not carry a headline, but it will carry weight. And weight in the end is what keeps a foundation from shifting under pressure. So the human lesson stands simple and strong. Rules are for protection, not performance. Power is for service, not spectacle. And justice is a promise kept one verified fact at a time. In that truth, heart steady, rooms quiet, and work begins again. The case will age, the names may blur, and the footage will be archived, but the lesson will remain usable tomorrow morning. Let proof lead, let dignity hold, let authority follow the evidence rather than force the outcome. That is how a courtroom stops being a stage and returns to being a shelter. That is how a country remembers itself not in slogans, but in standards that ordinary people can carry into any room and set on any table. The courthouse doors had barely shut behind her, but the weight of what happened inside was already spilling into the street. Jasmine didn't slow her stride until she reached the wide granite steps where a cluster of people waited. Not reporters chasing headlines, but citizens clutching folders, photos, and unanswered questions. The winter air bit hard, yet no one moved. They weren't here for warmth. They were here for direction. Jasmine scanned the crowd, her gaze locking on faces lined with years of being told no without explanation. She took a breath, grounding herself, then spoke not like a politician giving a speech, but like someone passing out instructions in the middle of a crisis. "This can't stop here," she said, her voice cutting clean through the wind. "If you think justice is safe because of one verdict, you're wrong. Justice only survives when people stand up for it every day in every place it's under threat." Her words landed like a spark in dry grass. A woman in the front row clutched a worn photograph of her brother, eyes fixed on Jasmine, as if the verdict had been for him too. Jasmine took a step closer, speaking directly to her. "That fine that got overturned today, it's not just about me. It's about every single one of you who's been told, 'We don't need proof, we just know you're guilty.'" The woman's jaw tightened. A man in a denim jacket beside her nodded slowly, as if replaying his own story in his mind. Jasmine didn't let the moment cool. "You want to apply this in your life? Start small, but start. When your city posts a new rule, read it. When your school board meets, show up. Ask questions. Make them explain in words you understand. And when they refuse, don't let them close the book on you. Force the pages open." Her tone shifted, low but sharp, a blade sliding from its sheath. "You don't need to be a lawyer to demand fairness. You just need to be someone who refuses to stay quiet when silence serves the powerful." The crowd edged closer. The cold stung, but no one cared. From the back, a man called out, "What if they don't listen?" Jasmine turned toward him, her answer immediate. "Then you make them. You bring 3 people, then 30, then 300. You show up so often they can't breathe without seeing you. You speak until ignoring you is more work than answering you. That's how you win, not in a single day, but in the days you refuse to quit." Murmurs rippled through the group, not of doubt, but of planning where to meet, who to call. Jasmine paced slowly, letting them feel the weight of her next words. "Don't let them tell you change comes from patience. Patience is how they buy time. Change comes from persistence. Persistent voices, persistent demands, persistent truth." She let the silence hang, then drove the point home. "And if you think your one voice doesn't matter, remember this case started with one voice refusing to be drowned out." A teenager near the edge raised a shaky phone to record, eyes wide. An older man muttered to himself, "This is what we've been needing," and didn't realize Jasmine had heard him. She gave him a slight nod before speaking again. "Find one thing in your community that's wrong. Just one. Don't scatter your focus, lock on to it, and don't stop until it's fixed. If they know you won't let go, they'll have to deal with you. That's how you build power. That's how you protect justice. Her gaze swept over the crowd, seeing more than faces, seeing potential. She knew not everyone here would follow through, but some would, and some was enough to start a chain. "This isn't about me," she said finally, her voice dropping to a razor's edge. "It's about all of us deciding that the rules apply to everyone or they apply to no one. I don't care who's in the mayor's chair or behind the bench. If they can't prove what they claim, they don't get to punish you for it." No applause followed, no chants, just the heavy quiet of people realizing they had work to do. Jasmine stepped down the last of the courthouse steps, and the crowd instinctively made a path. But they didn't leave. Not yet. Conversations were sparking, names exchanged, plans murmured. The wind still cut through the plaza, but now it carried something else, a current of resolve that wouldn't be gone by morning. Jasmine paused at the bottom of the steps, turning once more to face the cluster of people. Her voice, now quieter, forced everyone to lean in. "Don't wait for permission to care," she said, her eyes locking on one person after another. "The moment you wait, you've already lost ground. They count on you being too busy, too tired, too afraid. Don't give them that gift." A woman in a nurse's uniform gripped her tote bag tighter. A young man in a mechanic's jacket stood straighter. Jasmine pointed gently toward them. "You nurse, mechanic, teacher, parent, your fight matters. You don't need to know every law. You just need to know when something is wrong and be ready to say it out loud." The wind tugged at her coat, but she didn't move. "One day it won't be me standing here. It'll be you. And I want you to remember this moment, because the first time you speak up, they'll try to make you doubt yourself. Don't let them. If the truth is on your side, you already have more power than they do." Then she turned and walked away, leaving the air thick with something stronger than applause, expectation. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.